On the morning of November 14, 1944, Professor Arthur Whitmore stood before a conference table at the War Office in London, his hands trembling slightly as he held a sheet of paper covered in equations. Outside, the city was adjusting to a new terror. German long-range rockets that arrived without warning, faster than sound itself, striking before anyone could hear them coming. The assembled military officers believed they were about to waste an hour listening to an eccentric mathematics instructor from Cambridge who claimed he could predict where these weapons would land. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of predictive targeting analysis that would revolutionize warfare for the next 8 decades. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these skeptical officers were about to discover would transform their understanding of modern conflict, proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon in a war is not steel or explosives, but a mind capable of seeing patterns where others see only chaos. Arthur Whitmore had never imagined himself involved in military affairs. At 47 years old, he had spent 23 years teaching advanced mathematics at Cambridge, living a quiet life of theorems and chalk dust. His specialty was probability theory and statistical analysis, subjects his students often found impossibly abstract. When the war reached British soil, Arthur had volunteered for various civil defense roles, but his poor eyesight and age had kept him far from anything resembling frontline service. Instead, he spent his evenings as an air raid warden, walking the blacked-out streets of his neighborhood, ensuring citizens followed blackout protocols. Everything changed on September 8, 1944, when the first V-2 rocket struck London. Unlike the V-1 flying bombs that had terrorized the city through the summer, these new weapons were true ballistic missiles. They traveled at over 3,000 miles per hour, reaching altitudes of 50 miles before plummeting back to Earth. There was no air raid warning, no sound of approaching engines, no chance to take shelter. The explosion was simply there, followed seconds later by the supersonic boom of the rocket's descent. Arthur's initial interest was purely intellectual curiosity. He began collecting data from newspapers and BBC reports, marking impact locations on a map of London he had pinned to his study wall. His wife, Margaret, thought it was his way of processing fear, giving himself the illusion of control over the uncontrollable. But Arthur saw something else emerging from the pattern of dots on his map, something that made his pulse quicken with the thrill of discovery. By mid-October, Arthur had documented 73 separate impacts. He spent hours each evening analyzing the data, measuring distances between strikes, calculating angles from known launch sites in the Netherlands, plotting distributions across different areas of London. What fascinated him was not the randomness everyone assumed, but the subtle patterns underneath. The rockets were not falling randomly at all. The German forces were aiming for central London, particularly government districts and transportation hubs. Arthur understood they could not achieve pinpoint accuracy. The rockets were subject to numerous variables, including weather, mechanical variations, and computational errors in trajectory calculation. But those errors themselves followed mathematical rules. If Arthur could determine the German targeting parameters and the statistical distribution of their errors, he could predict not where individual rockets would fall, but which areas had the highest probability of being struck next. The mathematics was complex but elegant. Arthur developed a model incorporating launch azimuth, known targeting priorities, measured error distributions from previous impacts, and probability density functions. He worked late into the night, filling notebook after notebook with calculations. His colleagues at Cambridge thought he had become obsessed, perhaps even slightly unhinged by the stress of constant bombardment. Then, on November 7th, Arthur made his first prediction. Based on his calculations, he determined that the area around Deptford High Street had a 78% probability of receiving an impact within the next 14 days. He wrote a letter to the War Office explaining his methodology and his conclusion. He expected it to be filed away and forgotten. Instead, 3 days later, he received a terse summons to appear before a military planning committee. Colonel James Hartford commanded the committee reviewing civilian defense strategies. At 52, he was a career officer who had survived the trenches of the Great War and now found himself fighting a very different kind of conflict. He had little patience for what he considered academic theorizing, especially from civilians who had never seen combat. When his aide placed Arthur's letter on his desk, his first instinct was to dismiss it entirely. But something made him pause. The mathematical reasoning was sophisticated, far beyond the amateur analysis that regularly crossed his desk from well-meaning citizens. Hartford had studied engineering at Sandhurst before the Great War and retained enough mathematical literacy to recognize genuine expertise. Against his better judgment, he decided to give this Professor Whitmore 15 minutes to present his case. Arthur arrived at the War Office on November 14th, carrying a battered leather case containing his maps, calculations, and predictions. He was escorted into a conference room where 5 officers sat waiting, their expressions ranging from bored to openly skeptical. Colonel Hartford gestured to a chair but did not offer a greeting. Arthur began speaking, his voice initially nervous but gaining confidence as he explained his methodology. He described how he had analyzed the impact patterns, identified the German targeting strategy, calculated the error distribution, and developed a predictive model. Several officers exchanged glances that Arthur interpreted as dismissive. He pressed on, laying out his maps and showing his calculations. When Arthur announced that he had identified 23 specific areas where future impacts were highly probable, one major actually laughed. Another officer asked whether Arthur was suggesting they evacuate a quarter of London based on mathematical speculation. Hartford remained silent, studying the maps with narrowed eyes. Lieutenant Sarah Brennan was the only officer in the room who found herself genuinely intrigued. At 28, she had been recruited into military intelligence from her position as a research mathematician at Oxford. Her role involved analyzing enemy communication patterns and supply logistics. She recognized immediately that Arthur's approach was not speculation, but rigorous statistical analysis. When the other officers began packing up, clearly ready to dismiss Arthur entirely, she spoke up. "Tell me, Professor Whitmore," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations, "what is your confidence interval for these predictions?" Arthur looked at her gratefully. "For the 23 primary zones, I estimate between 72 and 89% probability of impact within 30 days, with the highest probability areas around 85%. Hartford leaned forward. "And if you are wrong? If we divert resources based on your calculations and nothing happens, then I am wrong," Arthur replied simply, "and you have wasted some time listening to a mathematics teacher with delusions of strategic importance. But if I am right, you will have advance warning about which neighborhoods face the greatest danger. You could prioritize emergency services placement, pre-position rescue equipment, or at minimum increase civil defense presence in high-risk areas." The room fell silent. Finally, Hartford spoke. "Very well, Professor. We will observe your predictions for 2 weeks. If your high-probability areas remain unstruck while impacts continue elsewhere, we will not waste further time. But if your calculations show merit, Lieutenant Brennan will work with you to develop this further." He paused, his expression stern. "I trust I do not need to explain that everything discussed in this room is covered by the Official Secrets Act." Arthur nodded, his mouth dry. He had not expected even this much consideration. That afternoon, Sarah Brennan appeared at Arthur's home in Cambridge, carrying boxes of additional impact data from military intelligence, information far more detailed than what Arthur had gleaned from public sources. This included estimated launch times, trajectory angles calculated from eyewitness accounts, and precise damage assessments. As they spread papers across Arthur's dining table, Margaret brought tea and biscuits, treating this extraordinary intrusion into their domestic life with characteristic equanimity. Over the following days, Arthur and Sarah worked to refine the predictions. Sarah brought a rigorous analytical discipline that complemented Arthur's theoretical creativity. She challenged his assumptions, forcing him to justify every parameter in his model. Together, they recalculated probability distributions for each of the 23 zones, ranking them by risk level. The highest probability area, according to their analysis, was a section of Camberwell measuring roughly half a square mile. Arthur calculated an 87% chance of impact there within 30 days. Sarah took this information back to Hartford, who ordered subtle increases in emergency services presence without triggering public alarm. On November 17th, 3 days after Arthur's presentation, a V-2 struck Camberwell, impacting less than 200 yards from the center of Arthur's predicted zone. Hartford called Arthur and Sarah to the War Office immediately. His demeanor had shifted from skepticism to intense interest. One correct prediction might be coincidence. Let us see about the others. Over the next 23 days, something remarkable happened. Rockets continued falling on London at the rate of 3 to 5 per day. But increasingly, they struck within or very near Arthur's predicted zones. By November 28th, 7 of his 23 areas had been hit. By December 5th, it was 12. By December 15th, 18 of the 23 zones had received impacts. Each confirmation sent shockwaves through the military planning apparatus. Officers who had dismissed Arthur as a deluded academic now sought his advice. Hartford assigned Sarah to work with Arthur full-time, establishing a small analytical unit dedicated to refining and applying his predictive model. But Arthur found no satisfaction in being proven right. Each confirmed prediction meant real impacts, real destruction, real people affected. He began visiting strike sites, walking through damaged streets, seeing firsthand the human cost of the patterns he charted on paper. It haunted him, this terrible validation of his work. Eleanor Davies was 63 years old when Arthur's prediction may have saved her life. She lived in Woolwich, in one of the zones Arthur had marked as high probability. When civil defense authorities quietly encouraged residents of certain areas to stay with relatives elsewhere if possible, Eleanor initially dismissed it as rumor. But her daughter, who worked at a hospital and heard things, insisted she move in with her in Ealing for a few weeks. On December 9th, a rocket struck Eleanor's street, collapsing the building where she had lived for 37 years. She stood in the rubble 2 days later, tears streaming down her face, holding a photograph album she had retrieved from the wreckage. A civil defense volunteer mentioned that someone in the government had identified the area as high risk, which was why they had increased their presence there. Though she lost her home, the advanced positioning of rescue equipment and medical personnel meant the few neighbors who remained received immediate assistance. Several lives were saved because resources were already in place. Eleanor never learned Arthur's name, but she understood that someone had cared enough to calculate, to warn, to prepare. In a war that often felt arbitrary and senseless, there was comfort in knowing that someone was trying to impose order on chaos. Meanwhile, across the North Sea, Major Klaus Richter of the German Artillery Command struggled with his own calculations. The V-2 program represented the pinnacle of German wartime technology, a weapon that should have been devastating to British morale. Yet intelligence reports suggested British civil defense was somehow anticipating strike zones, pre-positioning resources in ways that seemed impossibly prescient. Klaus reviewed launch logs, trying to determine if there was a pattern in their targeting that the British might have detected. The rockets were aimed at central London using coordinate systems and ballistic calculations, but achieving precision was impossible. Weather conditions, slight variations in fuel mixture, minuscule manufacturing differences, all introduced errors. These errors should have been effectively random from the British perspective, yet somehow they appeared to be responding to patterns Klaus himself could not see. It frustrated him deeply. They had created a weapon that traveled faster than sound, reached the edge of space, carried a ton of explosives. Yet mathematical analysis, something that required no resources beyond paper and intelligence, was undermining its effectiveness. Klaus wondered if this was the future of conflict, if wars would increasingly be won not by superior weapons, but by superior information processing. By December 20th, 21 of Arthur's 23 predicted zones had been struck. The Military Planning Committee now treated his analysis as critical intelligence. Hartford authorized expansion of Arthur's unit, bringing in additional mathematicians and analysts. They began applying similar methodology to predict where German forces might target other cities, to analyze supply route vulnerabilities, to optimize British resource allocation. Sarah Brennan found herself transformed from a junior intelligence officer to a key architect of this new analytical approach. She worked 16-hour days, developing new statistical tools, training other analysts in Arthur's methods. briefing senior commanders who still struggled to understand how mathematics could predict something as chaotic as rocket impacts. The 22nd prediction was confirmed on December 27th, when a rocket struck Lewisham within Arthur's designated high-probability zone. That left only one prediction unconfirmed, an area in Stepney where Arthur had calculated a 74% probability of impact. As January 1945 began, that final zone remained untouched, while rockets continued falling across London. Some officers suggested Arthur's success rate was already unprecedented, that 22 out of 23 represented remarkable validation. But Arthur fixated on that final zone. He rechecked his calculations obsessively, looking for errors in his methodology. Had he made a mistake? Was his model breaking down? Sarah tried to reassure him. A 74% probability means there is still a 26% chance of no impact, she reminded him. Your model does not claim certainty, only likelihood. You have been proven dramatically correct on the overall approach. But Arthur could not let it go. The perfectionist who had driven his students mad with demands for rigorous proof now turned that same scrutiny on himself. On January 11th, at approximately 2 in the afternoon, the final prediction was confirmed. A V-2 struck Stepney, impacting within the zone Arthur had designated 78 days earlier. All 23 predictions, made before any of the impacts occurred, had proven accurate. The implications rippled far beyond civil defense planning. Arthur's methodology demonstrated that even in warfare's apparent chaos, mathematical patterns existed and could be exploited. His work contributed to the development of operational research, a field that would transform military planning. After the war, the techniques Arthur pioneered would be applied to business logistics, urban planning, epidemiology, and countless other fields. But in that moment, standing in his study with Sarah and Hartford, looking at the map where all 23 zones were now marked with impact dates, Arthur felt no triumph. He thought of Eleanor Davies and thousands of others who had lost homes and loved ones. He thought of the German soldiers and scientists who had created these weapons, likely brilliant people whose talents had been directed toward destruction. He thought of the terrible efficiency with which human beings had learned to harm one another. "What troubles you, Professor?" Hartford asked, observing Arthur's somber expression. "This is a remarkable achievement." Arthur looked at the older officer. "I have proven that we can predict where weapons will fall. I have not discovered how to prevent them from falling at all." Hartford nodded slowly. Perhaps that is the next problem for mathematicians to solve. In the months that followed, Arthur's unit grew to include 23 analysts, an unconscious numerical echo of those original predictions. They expanded their work beyond V-2 impacts to analyze broader strategic questions. Sarah Brennan became the unit's deputy director, her mathematical brilliance finally receiving the recognition it deserved. Together, they helped optimize resource allocation for the final months of the European war. The German rocket campaign against London continued until March 1945, when advancing Allied forces captured the launch sites in the Netherlands. In total, over 1,000 V-2 rockets struck England, causing nearly 10,000 casualties. But the mathematical prediction work Arthur pioneered helped civil defense authorities save countless lives by improving emergency response and resource deployment. After the war ended, Arthur returned to Cambridge, resuming his teaching position. His work with the War Office remained classified for years, and he rarely spoke of it even to Margaret. His students never knew that their somewhat absent-minded professor had revolutionized predictive analysis under the stress of bombardment. Sarah Brennan continued in military intelligence, becoming one of the first women to hold senior analytical positions in the British defense establishment. She maintained correspondence with Arthur for decades, occasionally consulting him on particularly challenging statistical problems. Their wartime collaboration had forged a friendship based on mutual respect and shared understanding of how mathematics could illuminate darkness. Klaus Richter survived the war and became a professor of engineering in post-war Germany. In the late 1950s, he read an unclassified paper about statistical prediction methods that had been used during the war. Though the author was unnamed, Klaus recognized the methodology that had frustrated him 20 years earlier. He found himself both impressed and sobered, realizing that the true competition had not been between weapons but between minds. Eleanor Davies lived to 91, dying peacefully in 1972. She never rebuilt in Woolwich, instead settling permanently in Ealing near her daughter. But she kept that rescued photograph album her entire life, and when grandchildren asked about the war, she told them about the mysterious someone who had calculated the danger and tried to protect people. She made it a story about human ingenuity and caring, which in a way it was. The 23 predictions became legendary within intelligence circles, studied as a case example of how theoretical mathematics could generate actionable intelligence. The specific methodology Arthur developed was refined and expanded, becoming foundational to operational research and predictive analytics, modern targeting systems, logistics optimization, risk assessment algorithms. They all trace lineage back to that mathematics teacher who saw patterns in chaos. Arthur Whitmore died in 1968 at the age of 71. His obituary in the Times mentioned his distinguished teaching career at Cambridge and his service during the war, but provided no details about the nature of that service. Only a handful of people who attended his funeral understood the magnitude of his contribution, how his refusal to accept randomness had helped save lives and transform analytical methodology. In his study, preserved by Margaret and later donated to Cambridge, researchers found the original maps and calculations from 1944. The 23 zones were still marked, each annotated with prediction date, confidence level, and actual impact date. Looking at those meticulous notes, it was impossible not to feel the weight of what Arthur had achieved, transforming abstract mathematics into a shield for strangers he would never meet. The story of Arthur Whitmore's ridiculous calculation trick, as skeptical officers had initially dismissed it, became a teaching example in intelligence academies and mathematics departments worldwide. It demonstrated that genius sometimes appears in unexpected forms, that the most powerful weapons against chaos are pattern recognition and rigorous thinking, and that one person armed with mathematics and determination can change the trajectory of history. What those officers in that November 1944 conference room could not have imagined was that they were witnessing not just a prediction about rocket impacts, but a glimpse of warfare's future. In an age that would bring computers, satellite surveillance, and artificial intelligence, Arthur's fundamental insight would prove prophetic. That information, properly analyzed, is as much a weapon as steel and explosives, and sometimes far more decisive. The mathematics itself was not magic. It was probability theory, statistical analysis, pattern recognition, tools available to anyone with sufficient training and dedication. What made it remarkable was Arthur's willingness to apply these tools to a problem everyone else had accepted as unsolvable. His courage to stand before skeptical authority and defend his conclusions, and his humanity in recognizing that every calculation represented real lives hanging in the balance. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.